now that I've got all you lovely folks here, we have a segment here that I've called the Left-Wing Market Anarchist Meme Review, with mostly images courtesy of LWMA Shitposting on Twitter. Now, there are some classic, and let's just start it off with the all-time classic. Can you watch my property for me? I forgot something in my car. This is your property? Sure. Now this is mine. Kevin, how do you feel about this here representation? We've got the authority in the room.
Well, I mean, I haven't used the Mutualist label in quite a while, but I kind of like just using this to own people. People like George Reisman saying, I leave my house to buy a quart of milk or something, you know, for 15 minutes, it'll be homesteaded by a mutualist. And I'm like, yeah, so.
Yeah. I do want to point out something in this that I didn't see before. This guy owns a car, or this ball has a car. It just makes me think, you left the car. Who's taking that shit? I don't know. I think private property is crumbling at multiple levels at this point.
You don't want to risk, you know, people thinking you seriously propose no one being able to have secure personal possessions or anything like that.
I just want to point out that maybe this meme is just saying, like, you know, it's cool to steal stuff from ANCAPs, and you know, maybe that's the conversation we had also.
I inherently dock points from political ideology ball comics. I'm not a fan of the format myself, but that's just my personal preference.
Yeah,
although I do like some of what it's inspired. So on the other hand,
I'm on this one.
Same.
All right. Well,
sorry, we're such harsh critics.
Yeah, well, you know, it's the first one. You gotta.
Well, I would give this one a 5. I also knocked down
5 out of what? 10.
10.
Yeah.
Also knocked down for being a ball meme, but I do like that it brings up the social aspect of navigating property rights. You know, like what is it that keeps your property secure? Other people's belief that they shouldn't touch it. You know?
Yeah.
I hate the orange and black thing, to be honest.
Yeah, not a huge fan of that either.
Especially the
I
super.
always thought it weird. The orange and black is the mutualist colors because it kind of gives it kind of gives credit to the theory that mutualism is a mix of ANCAP and ANCOM ideologies.
Yeah, and I mean, mutualism or tuck right individualism was just, you know, a self-declared form of socialism, which is red. And the whole gold thing with ANCAP, I mean, I don't see any need to split the difference with that kind of business.
Now here we've got a bit more of a modern format.
I love
leftism
this.
leaving people's bodies as soon as you ask them to stop defending IP law. This is definitely coming from the Twitter sphere.
Especially relevant in the current conversations around AI art.
Where is defending IP law like a significant thing for a major segment of the actual left? I mean,
So I don't think it's any particular faction. I don't think it's like MLs or DemSocs or anybody. I think it's people who are artists, and artists tend to be on the left. So, some of them happen to have, especially as they feel some of their ability to make a living being threatened, taken to reflexively defending IP in certain cases. So I don't think it's this org or that org or this faction or ideology or that faction. It's people who have a personal interest in their own IP being protected, not thinking through some of the implications of how this is enforced, what artificial scarcities it generates, and so on.
I just don't see that as being identified with the left as such anyway. I mean, I've seen it more from liberal artists and creators than anything who aren't really, you know, principled leftists at all. I also see leftists all over the place referring to copyright as book landlordism and stuff like that. So, I'm definitely a thumbs down on this one.
See, I'm a thumbs up on it, but in part because I think a lot of people have started identifying with leftism despite not understanding some of these aspects of it. So I don't know that it's an attack on any particular leftist philosophy so much as people who I think would, if asked, identify as leftists, but will then abandon that in order to defend something they see as necessary for their own livelihood.
Yeah.
You do and have always had the strain of people who think that IP is a workers' rights issue.
Yeah.
That people should have, you know, that intellectual property is the fruit of one's labor, and therefore, you know, you should have the right to the fruit of your labor. I think it's a completely bullshit argument. I think there's definitely merit to discussions on how to make sure people are properly, you know, paid for their art or, you know, other pieces of intellectual property as they're defined today. Like, you know, make sure people are properly compensated, people are given proper credit and recognition, things like that. We can have those conversations without relying on intellectual property laws and copyright and patents, all that shit to the degree that we have now. Like, or any, you know, it's stupid.
Okay, I see how I misread it now. It's actually saying defending IP law is incompatible with leftism, and it's
exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I could see also having that conversation because, you know, I certainly see like sticking up for small creators whose content was appropriated without any acknowledgement or credit by big corporations and that kind of.
And you can still have these ethics without relying on state laws.
You know, it's good praxis to, whenever you can, actually, you know, financially support indie artists and creators by paying for their stuff. But, you know, when it comes to anything that's, you know, major corporate property like a video streaming service or record companies or the big publishing companies are using the creators deserve to be paid argument to stop people from downloading stuff for free. You know, fuck that.
I'd even go so far as to say, like, in a different world, artists wouldn't have to, like, small artists, indie artists wouldn't have to be sticklers about IP to, like, make sure they're fed. I also think about, like, the history of all art having to do with people training themselves by copying the masters, right? Like, that's how people learn to do art.
Yeah.
And I see AI as essentially doing the same thing as the art student who's sitting in the gallery copying a Dutch master, right? Like,
yeah, it would be one thing if they were straight up ripping off artwork, like just copying it, you know, and passing it off. But the fact that it remixes, it's really hard to make an argument like, okay, that it's taking away from another artist because, okay, then that artist could have made that. If that's the argument, like, but they didn't, then AI made it.
Now, this one,
I don't
know how hard a pill this is to swallow, personally. Like, private security operates, sure, you could say different incentives, all of that, but in the sense where,
it depends on what you mean by
this one actually
is different from you hired a bodyguard because you got a death threat.
Well, it's definitely taking a punch at the kind of right-wing ANCAPs who are always saying, you know, the solution to this or that problem with government misbehavior is to privatize it to some capitalist business firm.
So here's the thing is, like, for one, being a member of the IWW, we do not include cops, but we do include private security.
The IWW also, I will say, provides private security for a fair number of events.
So it's one of those things that's very hard to parse because, like, okay, I can argue that, you know, for instance, there's an IWW member out of Orlando who I know works as a Disney private security guard. We can argue that, you know, Disney security, because of their corporate bosses, blah, 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 they have, you know, pretty shitty incentives to enforce pretty shitty things at times. At the same time, nobody's really going to argue that Disney doesn't need security. So,
I mean, I got an even better example. So, you know, my synagogue up here has one lady who is our security guard. With everything that has gone on in the past couple of years and where we are, I'm really glad she's there. I'm not going to lie. I don't know about this one. I give this one.
That's what I was going to say too. I've worked private security. I've volunteered as staff for conventions. Now, am I one that tends to turn a blind eye to things a lot more, you know, to a lot more, you know, petty or victimless things that they don't really want us to turn a blind eye to? Yes. But at the same time, conventions still need security. The reason Yowie paddles are Yowie and Yuri paddles are banned from conventions, and I've been going long enough to remember the fond days of Yowie and Yuri paddles, and it was great for the time that it lasted. But there were many instances where people got sent to the hospital, and finally, what actually got those banned, some person decided that they were going to run from across the room and paddle someone without even checking in for consent, just surprise paddle someone and slam them so hard with the paddle that they shattered their pelvis and actually paralyzed this person. That's the reason why Yowie and Yuri paddles are banned from anime conventions. We need security because honestly, anime fans are stupid as shit. And I say this as an anime fan.
And there's a distinction to be made between groups of people maintaining security in their own spaces and the kind of private mercenary security that patrols public rights of way and bothers people that are going about their own business. And I mean, you see from a lot of right libertarians proposals to give taxpayer money to private police agencies, which is
and that's just the convention is one level of security. On the other level of security that I've worked is being part of Redneck Revolt and Pink Pistols and various gun clubs. We've provided security to pride parades. To pride events in general. We've provided security when Mike and Debbie Africa got out of prison and came to come speak in Gainesville. They asked us to be their security. And I mean, now you have people out there, you have gun clubs and others protecting things like Drag Queen Story Hour and stuff like that. Okay,
John Brown Gun
what
Club,
is the difference between, we can argue that, okay, most of those are volunteer forces, and so they're not corrupted by profit motives to defend things they wouldn't otherwise defend. It's still private defense, even if they're not paid. Yeah. So is the only real thing separating good from bad private defense a profit motive? People deserve to be compensated for their labor, and some people would do shit without profit motive but still like to be paid for it too.
Well, private to me is just really an inadequate term because it's getting into that ANCAP framework where it's either a private security business firm, and that's ignoring the existence of all kinds of stuff in the commons, like the kinds of neighborhood arrangements the Black Panthers advocate, or what the EZLN communities in Central America are doing, or the Rojava Kurds.
So would we say maybe instead of, I've heard people argue in similar situations, instead of the term private, use mutual or social. So should we call this mutual security or social security?
How about it? ACAB includes capitalist security firms or something like that.
Yeah. I mean,
ACAB includes Pinkertons.
Yeah. I like the term Pinkertons just because it makes me feel old-timey and
Although we talk about Pinkertons like they don't still exist. We talk about them as if it's old-timey and blah, blah, blah. But we got to remember the last time Pinkertons were actually big in the news wasn't it a Pinkerton killed a fucking fascist at a protest?
Okay, there's an exception to everything. Sometimes they're okay.
So I think ultimately the way I think about this is sort of an Ostromian approach of no panaceas, right? I think a lot of anarcho-capitalists want to treat it as states bad, private, especially for profit, good, and treat privatization as a panacea. That's wrong for all the reasons that have been articulated here. At the same time, I don't think something being, say, community run without a profit motive means it's great, or something being run for profit in a commercial context means it's bad, right? The fact that the security person at a synagogue that's been receiving Nazi death threats or whatever is paid doesn't mean that she's bad. And the fact that the Minutemen are run by people who care about their communities and want to stop immigrants on that basis doesn't mean they're good. They are, in fact, bad and enforcing injustice. I think what we ultimately need to do is recognize, one, that there are certain features of the monocentric and privileged nature of state power that make it especially prone to perverse dynamics. And then beyond that, when we're considering non-state modes of defense and security, engage in the nitty-gritty detailed analysis of institutional details and recognize that there's a lot of potential for polycentric defense of various types, both commercial and non-commercial, to emerge in ways that are perverse and in ways that are pro-social. And so ultimately, we need to take a polycentric Ostromian approach, which of course I would say as the author of Polycentric Defense, which you should download from SSRN, but...
Jumping off of that, I'm going to go all the way up theoretically and all the way down. So all the way up, there's even a question about what security means here. Private is just not the only ill-defined term. I'm working on some IR scholarship right now about what do we mean when we say security, because you can mean all sorts of things by security. You can mean no private property gets destroyed. You can mean no one gets killed. You can mean cooperation is encouraged. You can mean anything by security, right? Even security is hard to define. Going all the way down to this, like Nathan was saying, you have to get into the specifics of how the institution is formed. One of the things that has annoyed me forever is the discussion on private prisons and the fact that private prisons were just prisons run exactly the same as government prisons, but owned by a private company who got paid by the government to do exactly the same thing, versus an idea that had been thrown out at the time was a type of prison where administrators got paid based on reductions in recidivism rates. And that would have been a slightly better prison, not great, not perfect, but I think there's a lot of questions here that this meme gets a 0 from me.
These pills are quite hard to swallow, it turns out. I underestimated it at the beginning. I should have brought more water.
We will not swallow them.
Here, now I'm glad that we got some equal representation here. On the left here, we got the Communist Party USA, Libertarian Party over here. Corporate needs SEK3 to find the difference between this picture. And we got him saying they're the same one.
From Konkin's point of view, this definitely is A+, but I'd say from an individual's, the individual reading its point of view, it's going to be very, very subjective.
Yeah, it's like these are they're very different beasts. Like libertarian party's reactionism.
They're both pretty Leninist.
Yeah, they're both Leninist in the sense that Konkin critiques, and they both have strong authoritarian factions, right? Like maybe 3 years ago, it would have been fair to say that the LP is less bad than the Communist Party because it doesn't have people who valorize authoritarians. But at this point, with the Mises Caucus takeover and the crypto-fascist nature of, or maybe not so crypto anymore, nature of some elements of that faction, not going to say all elements of that faction, but certainly some significant elements of that faction, I would say that you've got two parties that have quasi-revolutionary stated ends, seek to achieve those via electoral means that involve seizing state power, and that in the process will play apologist for really brutal and repressive authoritarians. So at this point, I'd say the similarities are pretty strong, both in terms of the revolutionary and character of the ideology that they're corrupting and paying lip service to, the illiberal electoralist means or authoritarian electoralist means they're using, and the authoritarian forces and factions that they will all too often be apologists for. I say they're not necessarily the same picture, but close enough.
I would still say that the LP, especially in a local level, is still useful.
In redder states, the LP seems to be staying further left. And I think it makes sense, right? The LP formed itself in reference to its opposition. And so in harder red states, the LP has always been further left.
Utah, for example, has a similar dynamic.
Yeah, right. Here in Michigan,
a lot of geo-libertarians and so on involved.
Yeah. And Michigan's a split, but in really red parts of Michigan, you have extremely left libertarians as the libertarians. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, we see similar sorts of things in Virginia, right? Like the LP Virginia as a whole, especially Southern Virginia, is more of a red state, and that the people who were then for a while leading the LP of Virginia tried to disassociate from the National Party. Meanwhile, Libertarian Party of Northern Virginia got effectively taken over by the Mises Caucus, and that's in part, I would guess, because Northern Virginia is a much more liberal area, so people whose main grievance is, say, mask mandates might have more of an incentive to join up with the Libertarian Party and say, the primary form of liberty is my freedom to feel the free air in front of my face.
Yeah, and I even got into the situation where the sort of LP people who were in Philly were so far right that during the George Floyd protests, they were doing the whole vigilante shoot looters thing, to the extent that one of them reached out to me and said, hey, you're a libertarian in Philly. Do you want to help us do that? Jesus. And I just like quietly noted down where they were going to be and like.
Right.
See, I don't know if anybody did that within the Libertarian Party of Northern Virginia, but I was in a group chat where people were like talking as if they would support such things, and that was quite disturbing. So
yeah,
it's never fun when like someone you thought might be an ally texts you and is like, "Do you want to go shoot your other friends with me?" And I'm like,
I don't know. It's just really silly to compare it to a party that has never had nearly as much influence or legitimacy. Now, I will say they both fall into trying to recuperate American or trying to utilize American patriotic rhetoric to advance revolutionary causes. CPUSA has been notorious for trying to for basically doing the patriotic socialism bullshit before that was really given a name. They tried to, they've always tried to position communism as an expansion of our Constitution and as living up to the ideals of our Constitution. I think if you're going to compare the LP to any party, yes, CPUSA is probably the closest you can get to, because there's a lot of apt comparisons.
Again, very sort of Twitter-centric, very specific. The sort of nihilist versus market anarchist thing. This was posted around that time. We got the baby anarchists just beginning, and they can go down the neat little left libertarian path versus the Serafinsky sort of we live in a meat grinder, be prepared to get turned into a sandwich, sort of thing.
So I think there's a mistake that happens here, where insurrection gets tied to nihilism. And that's wrong. I titled our last poetry feature, Rage is a Positive Emotion, and I did that on purpose because I don't think that insurrection and nihilism are the only way of viewing that sort of action outlook, saying we need to just burn stuff down, we need to just do destruction. It really depends on how you're thinking about it. And there is a side of it that goes into the sort of primmy, anti-civ, ruin everything, fuck humanity side of things. But I do think there's another side of it which recognizes that you're not going to have that picture on the left either. There's no pretty castle where we get to market anarchism through all agreeing. And like, that's just not realistic. I think there is something about realizing that violence is yours to control that is really important to individualism. Because one of the things that the state does is centrally what the state does is it forms this monopoly on violence. It tells you that only the state or, its deputized agents can do violence and all other violence is bad and is different. It's categorically different. And that's not true, right? That's what I think what the most fundamental thing to understand is like, that's categorically not true. And it's important to understand both from the standpoint of, hey, I can do violence too if I choose to, might not be a good idea, might not be a good tactic, might not be good for me personally, but it's an option on the table. And the other side is it helps you realize when the state justifies its violence, it has no more justification than you do, or your neighbor does, or whoever else is acting that way. And so I do like the kind of rightward path in the sense of like saying some very important things, some very realist things about violence. The thing I'm most proud of ever writing is my meditation on violence in our Fighting Fascism book, which goes through basically what I just said. And then this additional, there's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't give in to violence. There's a lot of reasons why we should still have it on the table. And we have to look at both of those at the same time to like land in a place that is good. You know?
I also really just fought hard with the messaging of that. That helped me figure out a lot of stuff, particularly about that sort of more libertarian, non-aggression sort of styling, which is what introduced me to a lot of these ideas to begin with. So I have a lot of sympathy for that. Yeah. Even though whatever the hell I'm doing now is very much not that. But
yeah, I wrote it basically for libertarians to understand why those of us who maybe didn't consider ourselves libertarians anymore were okay with certain levels of political violence. But what it turned into as I was writing it, and why I ended up calling it a meditation on political violence, is it became me figuring out what I think about that. And saying, you know, on the one hand, I feel like fascists are making it very clear that they are willing to kill us and like form vigilante squads to do so. And we need to take that seriously. On the other hand, you don't want to live in right path world, right? Like, look at that. It's bad.
Yeah.
I was going to say this when I started. Also, desert. A lot of people read desert and get the implication that the purpose of that book is live in right path world. Yeah, I don't think that's true. You know, anyone who's actually studied desert is like, this is a warning about what could happen. It's not a how-to guide. For fuck's sake.
And that's the thing too, is that Blessed is the Flame, at least from my read of it, which is still largely sympathetic, is that it's talking about like you were saying earlier, the reclamation of violence for oneself, making particularly a distinction between that and formal organizations. And the metaphor of the prison camp dynamics is that you have this, you know, system of control that, you know, people have made these organizational attempts to chip away at and overthrow. And the narrative in Blessed is the Flame is not that, you know, independent action won over the Nazis, this is how you do it. In these situations, it is more effective in a lot of, you know, contexts, is you want to make it more decentral. And I think that's the thing. A lot of anarcho-nihilist memes reminded me of that, because they're talking about spontaneity in particular, which I realized after like really diving into that community for a while, wasn't really what they quite meant by that. But I don't like this one. I don't think it's good. It doesn't describe a real situation. Unless you're like going through Discord groups, in which case
don't join either of them. Talk to real humans outside and touch grass.
Yeah, and if you can't
touch grass, not fake meme grass.
Yeah, not shitty ass MS Paint shade. Make sure the shading on your grass is good before you touch it. You might catch something. Every masterpiece has its cheap copy.
See, we need Roderick on for this one. I feel like we can't talk about Ayn Rand without having Roderick on.
Or at least Corey.
I will say that this meme reminds me of that Carl Hess quote from Anarchism in America, where he says that, you know, when he read Emma Goldman, it was all the best of Ayn Rand, but without the solipsism. Everybody compares her to Emma Goldman, but should we be comparing her to left-wing libertarian writers and fiction writers and sci-fi writers, such as like, and this is going to sound like blasphemy, but would she be more akin to like an Ursula Le Guin?
So what I will say is I was exposed to both of them at roughly the same time, and that was in 5th grade. I became an obnoxious new atheist who was following the Positive Atheism website, and they had a big list of quotations, and that included a big list of quotations from Emma Goldman and a big list of quotations from Ayn Rand, because both were very critical of religion. Both were very critical of the anti-individualist nature of religious ethics, the way that Christianity in particular encouraged the sacrifice of bodily autonomy, encouraged the sacrifice of individual autonomy, encouraged self-sacrifice in the interests of others, and so on. And one essay, like I think the first Goldman essay I read was on the Positive Atheism website, and it was her essay, The Victims of Morality, in which she's saying the morality that the state promulgates that says you should follow the law, the morality associated with the notion that you should respect property, the morality that religion promulgates, especially insofar as it restricts women and restricts reproductive autonomy. These are all deeply destructive. And there's a strong similarity between Goldman's anti-moralism and the sorts of things that Rand says when she says, for instance, a moral commandment is a contradiction in terms, the moral is also the rational, and reason accepts no commandments. And so both of them are critiquing these sorts of down from on high systems of morality and saying the individual is sovereign, and respect for the individual and the individual's autonomy requires them being free to, through their own reason, discover what moral system is conducive to the individual's flourishing. So that's the point of commonality that I see, and perhaps part of why I see it is that was my initial exposure to both of them, was seeing them on the same website, associated with the same, in my view, correct, I don't think there's a God, but in my view, also nowadays often considered somewhat cringe, intro to politics. And so I see strong links between these two. I wouldn't say Rand is a cheap copy, but I would say that there's strong points of commonality surrounding the individualism, the critique of religion, the critique of the, in particular, anti-individualist nature of religion, and so on.
And both very Stirnerite. I mean, I think it used to be a debate whether Rand was actually influenced by Stirner.
Yeah.
And now I think it's pretty fairly decided that she was, and just never acknowledged that. I have two things. First, Evan sent us some AI-generated better versions of the left path.
Oh, awesome. I love it. That's some grass you can touch.
Absolutely.
But I also want to talk about one of Emma Goldman's friends that I didn't know about until very recently, and that's Sholem Schwartzbard. I'm going to put his wiki.
I have never heard of this person. I'm excited.
He's a Jewish anarchist assassin. Became an assassin after both world wars and lots of pogroms, and it's a great story. I would encourage everyone to read about this, because he's one of those people who kind of got everything right during a time period where no one got anything right. And it's impressive to me. There is a multi-part Cool People Who Did Cool Things podcast about him. And he was friends with Emma Goldman. So
that's awesome.
I'm convinced on the link. I don't like the cheap copy. I think that's just a bit of a punch below the belt, really. I like this one because it's just a screenshot from Anarchy 101. And this is posted as look at Reddit Anarchy. But I think what will happen to my pet tortoise in an anarchist society? I have a pet tortoise. What will happen to him? And there's over 300 responses to it. I think that shows other people, Marxists, Leninists, their dialectics and shit, they don't talk about the pet tortoises of the world. Here we have hundreds of replies about this pet tortoise because we fucking care. Right?
Well, it reminds me of how Joel used to end the Enragé, or maybe it was his Non Servium show. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
One of them, he used to ask, how would you get coffee in your version of Utopia?
Right.
Which I love. Just the small things.
It's the small things that connect, in fact, to big things, right? Like coffee as an industry, in practice, it's right now seems to have a fair amount of slavery on the production side in certain coffee supply chains. Pet tortoises are sort of a relatively benign instance of something that potentially implicates anarchist concerns surrounding animal liberation, right? Some anarchists would say having pets violates our duties to non-human animals. Others would say something to the effect of, well, having a pet is a care relationship that's mutual. As long as you're not abusing your pet tortoise, that's chill, but don't torture millions of chickens in factory farms, maybe.
I think that pet tortoise is going to have a banging good time. I like the vibe of this one. Just in case we got too heated about mutualism ball, this is just in there so we can.
This is asking the real questions. This gets 2 thumbs up, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, I second that. 2 thumbs up, 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
This one rules. This is
this
chill vibes, wholesome vibes. Bang.
Right. Yeah.